It all began in a single, shattering moment, when I saw the envelope of deception peel away from the lies I'd been told. I still remember the cold clarity of that instant. My wife, smiling as if nothing were amiss, boarding a jet-labeled business trip, while I clutched the remnants of our shared past in trembling disbelief. The truth blazed into focus like a wildfire. I wasn't the only one in love with the idea of us. Somewhere, hidden behind the guise of corporate travel, she had booked a honeymoon with her secret lover. And I was about to crash that paradise, determined to unmask the betrayal and reclaim my shattered pride. For years, I had believed in the sanctity of our marriage. I prided myself on being the supportive husband, the one who would always have her back. We had built our life on shared dreams and whispered promises, quiet dinners after long workdays, spontaneous weekend getaways, and future plans mapped out like a well-practiced dance. But that morning, as I sipped my coffee in our otherwise quiet kitchen, a nagging thought began to fester. Her recent business trip had stretched longer than usual, and her phone was now a fortress of guarded messages and cryptic replies. I dismissed it at first as stress. Perhaps a particularly grueling project had taken its toll on her. I never imagined that the fortress would soon collapse under the weight of betrayal. The first inkling of something amiss came when I noticed an unusual charge on our joint account, a sum far too extravagant for any legitimate corporate expense. My curiosity piqued. I began retracing her steps. Late-night texts that vanished before my eyes, emails with evasive subject lines, and a series of receipts from a luxury resort miles away from any corporate headquarters. Each new piece of evidence felt like a hammer blow to the fragile edifice of trust one had so carefully maintained. I remember feeling a dissonance in every heartbeat, a mix of anger, despair, and a strange, numbing sadness. The evidence was incontrovertible. A glossy magazine article featuring the very resort where she was supposedly attending meetings. A snapshot posted on an anonymous account that hinted at her laughter with a man who wasn't me. Even a missed call notification from a number I didn't recognize. In the silence of our living room that night, I confronted my own reflection in the darkened window, wondering how the woman I adored could weave such an intricate web of lies. The realization stung sharply. My wife had faked a business trip, staging a luxurious escape that masqueraded as a corporate endeavor, all to embark on a honeymoon with her affair partner. The betrayal was a mix of humiliation and fierce resolve. I could have crumbled under the weight of that revelation, but instead, a plan began to take shape in the recesses of my mind. I resolved to confront this deception head-on, to reclaim not only the dignity that had been stolen from me but also to force her into facing the consequences of her choices. I began to map out every detail of her supposed getaway, the dates, the location, even the name of the resort, and I booked a one-way ticket with a destination that felt as distant from my old life as the stars. The journey to the resort was a blur of restless anxiety and simmering fury. Each mile the plane covered was a step away from the life I thought I knew, yet a step closer to the raw truth. I questioned everything along the way. Was I the victim of a well-crafted romance or merely a pawn in her escape plan? The answers I knew would be revealed soon enough. I spent the flight rehearsing confrontations, grappling with the mix of emotions that churned within me, hurt, anger, and an unexpected curiosity about the person she had become. When I finally arrived at the resort, a sprawling oasis of modern luxury set against a backdrop of turquoise waters and endless sky, I was overwhelmed by an eerie calm. It was as if the beauty of the place had conspired to mute the chaos in my heart. I checked into a modest room in a quiet corner of the property, far enough from the manicured poolside and vibrant laughter of vacationers, yet close enough to observe the unfolding drama that I was about to crash. I spent the next few hours circling the resort like a ghost, piecing together the fragments of a wedding I had never been invited to attend. My eyes fell on a couple, entwined and carefree, whose every glance and gesture reeked of intimacy. I recognized the subtle elegance of the man beside her, an elegance that spoke of confidence and secrets, a man who had clearly taken over the role I once cherished. My stomach churned as I realized the depth of her betrayal. Every smile, every whispered joke between them was a dagger twisting in my heart. I was not merely confronting infidelity, I was facing the complete erasure of our shared history. The final act of my plan had begun to crystallize in my mind. I decided that I couldn't stand by silently as she celebrated her new fantasy. I needed to be the uninvited guest at her honeymoon, the storm that disrupted her carefully constructed illusion of bliss. I rehearsed my lines over and over, each one a bitter symphony of hurt and indignation. I imagined the confrontation, the look in her eyes when she saw me, the shock on his face as he realized I had come for more than just answers. I would confront them in the public eye, forced them to face the consequences of their choices, and reclaim what remained of my shattered self-respect. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson, I made my move. I slipped out of my room and headed toward the resort's grand lounge, where I had learned from discreet observations that they were scheduled for a celebratory dinner. The ambient lighting and soft music created an atmosphere of carefree indulgence, but I could feel the cold edge of reality creeping in with every step I took. I ordered a drink at the bar, my eyes scanning the room until I found them seated at a secluded table, their laughter echoing against the clink of fine china. Time seemed to slow as I approached. I felt the weight of every lost promise and every moment of trust that had been so ruthlessly betrayed. When I reached their table, the room fell into a brief, stunned silence. I could see the confusion, then a dawning realization in her eyes, as if she had known deep down that this day would come. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was charged with unspoken accusations and memories of what once was. I let the silence linger, savoring the brief power it granted me over the situation. Then, with a voice that trembled between fury and sorrow, I spoke the words I had rehearsed in countless nights of restless pacing. "How could you do this?" I demanded, my tone echoing off the pristine walls of the lounge. The question spilled out in a rush, a torrent of emotions that had been held at bay for too long. Was our life together just a lie? Did our promises mean nothing? I trusted you. Every word was laced with pain, and I could see the weight of each syllable crush the fragile veneer of her carefully curated reality. Her affair partner looked equally stunned, his eyes darting between us as if searching for a way to defuse the situation. In that charged moment, the world around us receded until it was just the three of us in a crucible of raw, unfiltered emotion. I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear not just of being caught but of facing the undeniable truth of her own duplicity. The tension was palpable, a noxious mix of betrayal and shattered dreams hanging in the air. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, absorbing the full magnitude of my decision. I had crashed her honeymoon, an event that was meant to be a celebration of love and commitment, now defiled by lies and infidelity. In that instant, every choice, every sacrifice I had made in the name of our union, seemed to vanish into the cold night air. I wasn't just confronting her, I was confronting every moment of trust that had been callously discarded. The stunned silence eventually gave way to murmured voices, and I knew that the confrontation was far from over. I left them sitting there, their expressions a turbulent mix of regret and shock, as I stepped away into the night. My heart pounded with a mixture of triumph and grief. I had taken my stand, shattered their illusion of bliss, and forced them to confront the ruinous consequences of betrayal. Yet, as I walked away from that table, I couldn't help but wonder if, in my quest for retribution, I had also begun the process of losing a part of myself. In the quiet that followed, I found no immediate catharsis, only the heavy burden of questions and the daunting uncertainty of what lay ahead. Would this act of confrontation bring closure, or would it spiral into further chaos? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. The facade of that perfect business trip had been irrevocably shattered, and with it, the last vestiges of a life I once knew. As I retreated to my room to gather my thoughts, the night echoed with the distant sounds of revelry and regret. The confrontation was only the beginning, a raw, unvarnished moment that promised to unravel a tapestry of secrets and lies. I realized that, sooner or later, the fallout from tonight's crash would force us all to confront the truth, however painful it might be. And as I sat alone in the dim light, a single thought resonated in my mind. This was not merely about infidelity, it was about reclaiming my dignity and redefining my future. The taste of betrayal still burned in my mouth as I retreated from the lounge, the echoes of our confrontation reverberating in every step I took. The night had grown heavier with silence, a silence that now seemed to speak louder than any accusation. I found refuge in the solitude of my modest room at the resort, the clatter of my own heartbeat the only sound in the oppressive quiet. I sat on the edge of the unmade bed, staring blankly at the closed door behind me, replaying every moment of that fateful confrontation. The angry words, the shocked stares, and the desperate silence that followed, it was all seared into my mind like a scar. For a long time, I did nothing but stare into the darkness, trying to untangle the myriad of emotions that warred inside me. There was anger, yes, raw and biting, but it mingled with a deep, aching sadness that threatened to swallow me whole. I was not merely a betrayed husband. I was a man betrayed by the person I once thought was my closest ally. How had our shared dreams become nothing more than a cruel illusion? I thought back to the countless evenings when we talked about building a future together, a future that now felt like a mirage in a desert of shattered promises. Unable to remain alone with my thoughts any longer, I forced myself to leave the sanctuary of my room and wander the quiet corridors of the resort. The once inviting spaces now felt like an alien world, each well-lit passageway a reminder of the intimacy we had lost. I found myself drawn to the balcony overlooking the moonlit ocean, its gentle waves offering a kind of muted solace. Leaning against the cool railing, I tried to make sense of the chaos. My mind drifted between memories of laughter shared and the bitter sting of lies uncovered. It wasn't long before my phone vibrated, a message blinking on the screen in the pale light. It was from her. The words were simple, almost clinical. "Meet me on the terrace. We need to talk." My heart pounded as I stared at the message, a collision of emotions flooding me. Part of me longed to scream in fury, while another part of me, one that still remembered the woman I loved, hesitated, desperate for any explanation that might soothe the pain. Despite every instinct urging me to retreat into my solitude, I knew that the confrontation was far from over. I had to hear her out, however painful the conversation might be. I made my way to the terrace, where the cool night air mingled with the faint sound of distant laughter and soft music from the resort's lounge. There, seated at a small table draped in a white cloth and illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns, was my wife. Her posture was slumped, her eyes red-rimmed and haunted, an image so foreign yet achingly familiar. Beside her sat a man whose presence, though less pronounced in the low light, seemed to radiate an unsettling confidence. He made no move to hide his discomfort, but his silence was as damning as any words. For a few long heavy moments, we all sat in a triangle of tension and regret. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling, laden with both defiance and sorrow. I know you must be hurting," she began haltingly, her gaze flitting between the two of us. "I never meant for this to go so far." Her words were soft, as if she feared that any louder tone might shatter what little remained of our shared history. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice barely a whisper at first, then rising as the dam of suppressed grief broke open. "Did our years together mean nothing? Was I just an obstacle in your quest for whatever it is you were chasing?" I struggled to keep my tone from cracking, every syllable a mix of incredulity and pain. The ocean behind me roared in silent sympathy as if it, too, mourned the loss of something sacred. Her eyes filled with tears that glistened in the moonlight, and for a moment, I saw the woman I once adored, the kind, passionate soul who had whispered dreams to me late at night. "I felt trapped," she confessed, her voice wavering. "Trapped in a marriage that had become a series of routines and expectations. I felt invisible, suffocated by the life we built, and I wanted to feel alive again." Her confession struck me like a lightning bolt, illuminating the dark crevices of our shared past. I could see, in that moment, the cracks in the foundation we had once thought unbreakable. I inhaled sharply, the bitterness in my chest mingling with a strange sense of pity. "And so you chose to escape by lying?" I asked, bitterness lacing my words. "You fabricated a business trip, a lie so elaborate that it took us all by surprise, and then you went on a honeymoon with someone else. How is that living? How is that feeling alive?" I felt the weight of my own disbelief, a crushing sense of inadequacy that had no right to exist in a moment like this. Her eyes, wet and searching, met mine. "I didn't plan for it to hurt you," she said, her tone pleading for understanding. "At first it was just the thrill, the escape from a reality that was suffocating me. But then I realized that every lie was another nail in the coffin of our marriage. I started to feel guilty, torn between the exhilaration of the unknown and the love we once shared. I didn't know how to choose." Her admission was raw and confessional, and for a heartbeat, I felt the walls around my heart weaken. But then reality came crashing back. My own pain, my sense of betrayal, and the endless question of what our love had truly meant. The man at the table shifted uncomfortably. He didn't speak, his silence echoing the unspoken truth that he was a participant in the unraveling of our lives. I turned my gaze upon him, and in his eyes I saw a reflection of my own disillusionment, a quiet resignation that confirmed his complicity without the need for words. "And you?" I asked him directly, my voice low and steady. "What do you have to say for yourself?" It was a question that wasn't meant to be kind, it was a demand for accountability. He hesitated before speaking, his voice measured and almost detached. "I never intended to hurt anyone," he said. "I thought I was giving her something she needed, something that our marriage, our routine, could never offer." His words, intended as justification, only deepened the chasm between us. I could see the conflict in his eyes, a man caught between the thrill of a forbidden romance and the weight of moral responsibility. But his explanation did little to soften the blow. There on that moonlit terrace, the world seemed to slow to a painful crawl. The conversation shifted, sometimes stalling in moments of silence too heavy to bear. I listened as my wife spoke of loneliness, of feeling unfulfilled, and of the gnawing desperation that had led her to seek escape. Yet every excuse fell short of mending the fissures in my soul. I wondered if our love had been so fragile all along, or if I had been blind to its decay until it was too late. As the hours crept on, the conversation grew more raw and honest. I found myself asking questions I had long feared to face. "Did you ever love me?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of the past. "Or was I just a convenient fixture in your life, a comfort until you found something more exciting?" Her silence in response was more damning than any lie, and I could feel the answers buried beneath layers of regret and self-deception. Eventually, the conversation reached a precipice. My wife's eyes glistened with tears as she admitted, "I loved you once, so much, but I lost myself along the way. I was chasing a freedom I thought would make me whole, and in doing so, I destroyed everything that mattered." Her voice broke, and for a long moment, all that existed was the sound of our shared pain, mingling with the soft whisper of the ocean below. In that moment, I realized that the confrontation was not a moment of catharsis but rather the beginning of a long and arduous reckoning. There was no immediate closure, no tidy resolution to our tangled emotions. Instead, there was only the stark recognition that our lives had diverged irreparably. I sat back, the cool night air mingling with the heat of my own conflicted feelings, and I wondered what the next step should be. Could we salvage any remnants of our past, or was this the end of a chapter that had once promised a lifetime of love and hope? After what felt like an eternity on that terrace, I finally rose to leave. The conversation had taken its toll on both of us, leaving us raw and exposed. "I need time," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "I need to figure out what this all means, and whether there's any future left for us." Her eyes pleaded with me for forgiveness, for understanding, but I wasn't sure I could offer either. I stepped away slowly, leaving her and the silent man behind, and walked back toward the cool darkness of the resort corridors. In the days that followed, I wandered through a haze of conflicting emotions. The confrontation at the terrace had not brought the clarity I had so desperately sought. Instead, it had opened old wounds that refused to heal. I spent long hours alone, wandering along the resort's secluded paths and finding solace in the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the shore. Each step seemed to echo the slow, painful unraveling of a life that I had once thought was secure and predictable. I found myself poring over old photographs and mementos of happier times. Images of laughter, vacations, and shared moments that now felt like relics of a bygone era. Every memory was a bittersweet reminder of what we had lost, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had ever truly known her, or if I had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. In those moments of solitude, the lines between love, betrayal, and self-deception blurred, leaving me questioning the very essence of who we were, and who I was meant to be. Eventually, I sought the counsel of a friend, a man whose steady presence and candid advice had helped me navigate darker times in the past. Over coffee in a quiet corner of a small cafe off the resort grounds, I recounted the events of the past few days in painstaking detail. My friend listened intently, his eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow and understanding. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the person you think you know isn't the person they truly are. And sometimes you have to let go of the past to find who you are meant to be." His words resonated with me, even as they underscored the painful reality that the life I had once envisioned was now irretrievably shattered. In the weeks that followed, the storm of emotions slowly gave way to a tentative acceptance of the new reality. I began to explore the possibility of forgiveness, not for her sake but for my own. Forgiveness, I realized, was not about forgetting or condoning what had happened, but about freeing myself from the endless cycle of bitterness and despair. It was about reclaiming my identity and rediscovering the parts of me that had been lost in the wreckage of our broken promises. One crisp morning, as I sat on a park bench watching the world awaken around me, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would no longer be defined solely by the betrayal that had upended my life. I started to rebuild, piece by fragile piece, acknowledging the pain and loss while daring to imagine a future unburdened by yesterday's regrets. I enrolled in therapy sessions, began writing in a journal of my own, and reconnected with old passions, small acts of self-care that slowly illuminated a path forward. There were days when the wounds felt too deep, when the weight of what had transpired threatened to drag me back into darkness. Yet, with every step I took, however tentative, I began to see that the crash had not been an end but a violent, painful rebirth. I was learning that true healing often required facing the most painful truths head-on, rather than burying them beneath layers of anger and sorrow. I started to understand that the illusion of a perfect marriage, the neat narrative of forever, was nothing more than a fragile construct that could shatter under the slightest pressure. Months later, as I packed my bags to leave the resort, a place that had become both a battleground and a crucible for my transformation, I took one last look at the terrace where it all began. The memory of that fateful night remained etched in my mind, the trembling confession, the tearful eyes, the silent, accusing void between us. I knew that I might never fully understand her choices or mine, but I also knew that the pain had imparted a hard-won wisdom. Sometimes, the act of crashing someone's carefully constructed fantasy is the only way to force the truth into the light. In the final hours of my departure, I paused at the airport, watching planes take off into the starlit sky. In that moment of quiet reflection, I realized that I was no longer the same man who had once been consumed by jealousy and betrayal. I was someone forged anew in the fires of heartache, someone who had faced the ruins of a shattered life and found the strength to build something different, something authentic. I knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to hope. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, letting the memories of the past wash over me like a tide, acknowledging each regret, each moment of sorrow, and each glimmer of unexpected clarity. In that silent, suspended moment, I whispered a farewell not only to the woman I had once loved but also to the life we had shared, a life built on promises that had ultimately proved too fragile to withstand the storm of reality. As I boarded the plane, leaving behind the remnants of a love that had once seemed unbreakable, I carried with me the bittersweet truth that sometimes, the most painful betrayals are the catalysts for profound personal growth. I may never forget the crash of that false honeymoon, nor the raw, unfiltered honesty that emerged in its wake, but I had learned that even in the aftermath of profound loss, there is a way forward, a path defined not by the scars of our past, but by the courage to embrace a future of our own making. Now, as I look back on that turbulent chapter of my life, I see it not only as a moment of profound betrayal but as the turning point that led me to rediscover myself. I learned that love is messy, that trust is fragile, and that sometimes, the most honest conversations come from the depths of our pain. And while the memory of that night will always haunt me, it has also become a reminder that even shattered dreams can give birth to a new, uncharted beginning. In the end, I walked away not as a defeated husband, but as a man who had dared to confront the painful truth and in doing so, found the strength to reclaim his life. The crash was not the end, it was the catalyst for my rebirth. And as the plane ascended into the night, disappearing into a sky filled with infinite possibility, I allowed myself to believe that, somewhere in the wreckage of betrayal and heartbreak, lay the seeds of a future defined by authenticity, resilience, and the quiet hope that, no matter how deep the wound, healing is always within reach.